there, ESL. So we're going to pick up with our reading of how women got the right to vote and chapter 3. So we're going to close this today, find out what happened and how did suffragettes get the right to vote. So chapter 3 is called Getting Closer to Success. Many people were still firmly against women getting the vote. These people were known as anti-suffragettes. They were called aunties for short. Aunties feared change. They thought families would be destroyed if women had the vote. In the South, white men feared that they would lose political power if black women won the vote. The men also believed that white women in the South were too modest to vote. By the new century brought many changes for women. More women went to college. More women worked outside the home. The laws in some states had changed to allow women to own property and keep their wages. Until World War I, women mainly fought for the vote within the state. The United States' entry into the war in 1917 changed. This is World War I, you guys. The nation was united in the war effort. Women would also unite to work for the vote. They began a national campaign to get women the vote through constitutional amendment. The fight for women's suffrage had been going on a long time. New younger leaders were taking over. They were not willing to wait patiently for the vote. Two of these leaders were Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. They had very different ideas of how to succeed. So here is one of the anti-suffragette postcards that was going around in 1917, which shows how granting women the vote would upset the relationship between a husband and wife. So here you see a wife bossing the husband around and him having to do the household chores. This is what people were afraid of. They thought that if women had the right to vote, that men would lose their power, which isn't true, but that's what they thought. So new leaders and new ways. Carrie Chapman Catt was born in 1859 in Wisconsin. She worked her way through college, then she became a teacher. She also began working for women's suffrage. She was largely responsible for Colorado agreeing to give women the vote in 1893. In 1900, she became an important leader and spokesperson for the women's suffrage movement. Catt decided that working for the war effort might help women win the vote. She believed that a show of patriotism would help them after the war. She arranged for women to save food, raise funds for the war effort, and work in hospitals. So here it says she was a forceful speaker. So that means she was a very good public speaker. Okay, so here we see an image of more than 5,000 people who marched for the right for women to vote and March 3rd, 1913 in Washington, D.C. So Alice Paul brought great energy to the fight for women's suffrage. In 1913, Paul organized thousands of marches for a parade in Washington, D.C. She met with President Woodrow Wilson, who said the states should give women the vote, not Congress. Next, Paul and others picketed or carried protest signs in front of the White House. One time, they chained themselves to the White House fence. The women were arrested. Paul went on a hunger strike in jail. Guards forced her to eat. Newspaper stories about these events brought the women plenty of sympathy. Victory at last. Paul's activities helped to change President Wilson's mind. Then Carrie Chapman Catt asked the president to pass a women's suffrage amendment as a war measure. She argued that the fight for democracy should begin at home. At last, Wilson agreed. He urged Congress to pass a women's suffrage amendment as vital to the winning of the war. In June 1919, it finally passed. It was the 19th Amendment. Now, the fight to ratify or approve it would go to the states. 36 states had to approve the amendment. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the final state needed to pass it. 8 days later, the amendment was signed into law, as at long last women could vote. So you see here in green all of the states that ratified in December 1919. In purple, the states that ratified in 1920 in March. And then Tennessee was the last one in August 1920. Here is our fearless leader. I'll show you her name again. Alice Paul. Okay, so in conclusion, this timeline shows major events in women's struggle for the vote. So really, it all began in 1833 when Lucretia Mott organized the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Philadelphia. And then in 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And then we have here in 1865 or 1861, the Civil War takes place and women try to help the war effort. So here is a nurse during the Civil War asserting herself. In 1865, the 13th Amendment frees the slaves. 1866, the 14th Amendment is passed, but citizens are defined as men or males. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is passed, but women do not receive the right to vote. In 1878, Susan B. Anthony Amendment is introduced into Congress for the first time, but as we saw, it was denied for over 40 years. In 1900, only 4 states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, had given women the right to vote. In 1913, Alice Paul organized the Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. 1917, the United States entered the World War I, and women make a great effort to the war contributions. 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And then finally, 1920, the 19th Amendment became law. So the fight began in 1833, and some could argue a little bit before that, but they did not get the right to vote until 1920. All right, guys, so hopefully you've answered all of the Edpuzzle questions, and we'll continue with our conversation on voting and elections tomorrow. Bye, guys.